The time is right for us as an arts advocacy organization to keep beating the drum, try to remind people in government just how important it is to support, center, and sustain the creative economy. I think I've always gravitated towards trying to step in on behalf of people who need help and aren't being given the respect and help that they need. And when we get to the other side of this, we are going to have to visit this now empty field. And in this empty field, we have an opportunity to build something new.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your access and connection to the live performing arts. In this podcast, you'll hear from some of the industry's most inspiring people from around the globe who create magic on stage and backstage. Our guests share their knowledge, passion, and the real stories of how a show comes together. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the StageLync podcast. My name is Robb, and today we're speaking with Carson Elrod. Carson is a professional actor and arts advocate. In the past 3 decades, he originated roles on Broadway and has appeared on stages off-Broadway and regionally across the country. He's appeared in such notable films as Wedding Crashers and Kissing Jessica Stein, and on a myriad of well-known television shows like 30 Rock and Law & Order. In 2020, during the COVID lockdown, he co-founded the Be an Arts Hero campaign that leveraged the power and platform of arts workers themselves to get to the attention of Congress in order to stabilize the creative economy. Shortly after, he co-founded Arts Workers United, a membership-based 501c4 that notably within a year of founding successfully lobbied the House of Representatives to hold a hearing called The Power, Peril, and Promise of the Creative Economy. He testified at the hearing in 2022. Carson, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, tell us, just because we have an international audience, what's going on in the arts in America in a summary?
Oh, all right. Well, that's a huge question. Let me start kind of with a 30,000-foot lens and go from there. I mean, first and foremost, when we talk about arts and culture in America, when we talk about arts workers, when we talk about the arts and cultural landscape, we are talking about 4.5% of America's GDP. We're talking about 5.2 million people animating 675,000 jobs, generating over $1 trillion in value added to the American economy. There is not a state in the union that doesn't have tens of thousands of arts workers generating billions for those states' economies, right? So also, you think we've got rock clubs and rock shows and comedy clubs and burlesque clubs and symphony and opera and theater, et cetera. So we have like this incredible, the world knows us for probably more than anything else is our kind of multinational billion-dollar media companies that generate Hollywood and film and television that goes all over the world. So despite the fact that we have this like kind of an incredible creative economy animated by some of the most imaginative, creative, most amazing artists in the world, we also have this very interesting lack of support for arts workers and for the creative economy at the federal level as it pertains to investing in new generations of arts workers, providing real resources and opportunities for Americans to feel that the creative economy and arts work is work that is real, valid, or stable. There's still some stigmas around it. There's still the kind of stereotype of the starving artist. And it's sad because, we think of our neighbors to the north. Canada appropriates about $2 billion a year for arts and culture. Germany, I think it's like 2.9 billion. And we could go around the rest of the developed world and talk about these, billions and billions of dollars worth of investments, where here we typically have about $207 million that is distributed to all 435 congressional districts across the United States. That is a very, very tiny amount of money federally compared to our developed neighbors. If we were to invest, say, on the same level that Germany did, we would be looking at more like a $10 billion arts endowment to go across the country. And when you think that typically $1 of NEA funding can leverage back up to 9 in public and private spending, wherever that money goes, it's one of government's most safe returns on investment when it comes to appropriations. And you can just imagine what the collateral impact might be if we actually invested at that level. But as you know, and this is kind of the car coming around the corner into the dumpster fire, is that we're currently at a place in the United States where anybody watching this knows that we have an administration that has an appetite for destruction, especially for federal agencies. And so one of the things that has happened over the course of the last few months has been the essential dismantling and destruction of the IMLS, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the NEH, which is the National Endowment of the Humanities. And then over the course of the last couple of weeks, thousands of National Endowment for the Arts recipients have gotten termination letters in their emails saying that the grants that had been promised to them by the federal government have been pulled and terminated. And the budget that was just released by the administration contemplated zeroing out all 3 of the agencies that I just mentioned. And so, despite the fact that we have a thriving creative economy, despite the fact that arts workers reliably pretty much just spread sunshine and money everywhere they go, and despite 4.5% of GDP, there hasn't been this federal acknowledgement of just how important arts and culture is to the American economy and to the American way of life. And so, the time is ripe for us as a arts advocacy organization to keep beating the drum, try to remind people in government just how important it is to support, center, and sustain the creative economy. I'll probably do a lot of alliteration. I just love alliteration. So I just end up doing that. I'm like, oh, yeah, a lot of S sounds there. Anyway, yes, that was the long answer to your opening question.
No, but what a wonderful summary. So thank you for that. I think it really puts it into context. I kind of want to ask you on that, though, aside from the current administration, this trend was obviously happening anyway before, aside from obliterating arts, groups and things like that. But this trend was going that way. Was it the pandemic that accelerated it? Was it already happening? What's the cause and effect of the pandemic being in that? Did it just accelerate this process, or what was your opinion on that?
I mean, ever since the NEA and these government entities were founded in the 60s by acts of Congress, there's been back and forth, most famously in the 80s, as it pertained to conversations about Karen Finley and Robert Mapplethorpe, and lots of kind of like public fighting about whether or not the government should support arts workers or art at all, whether or not it was something that should be left to the free market, et cetera, et cetera. So robust conversations were had in the 80s during the Reagan administration. And so every year, NEA funding could devolve into, a political football this way or that way. But I believe it was in the 80s that there were a couple of amendments put into the congressional charter that talked about artistic merit and artistic excellence. And then I think most notably the idea that individual artists were no longer getting grants. It was going to institutions that did sub-granting. And so that kind of inoculated the agency for a long time. And, it has had robust bipartisan support for decades, because as I said before, you belong to every single congressperson in the House of Representatives represents a constituency that benefits incredibly from the NEA. Like I said, the return on investment is kind of nutty. And so despite the fact that every now and again there's a political football aspect to arts funding at the federal level, I think it has recently, and I think largely because of lockdown, and that I'll angle my answer into there has been a new consciousness in Congress of just how important the creative economy is. And that's why the Save Our Stages legislation, which ended up being a $16 billion intervention on behalf of shuttered live venues, that was introduced in Congress by Amy Klobuchar and John Cornyn together, right? And so there really was, during lockdown, this idea that Congress started to see what the implications would be if we didn't stabilize and save the creative economy. And I'm proud that we were part of that effort. Be an Arts Hero was founded by arts workers to leverage the power and platform of arts workers themselves to get Congress's attention to the fact that, we generate more revenue than all of transportation combined. And yet like 10 airlines got $50 billion in support in the CARES Act, like right out the door. And the creative economy got 75 million in the CARES Act, while the entire performance ecosystem of the United States had essentially collapsed overnight. And so what lockdown did is, I think it made it very, very clear to arts workers themselves just how precarious things were. I don't think anybody contemplated, our lives are already hard. You know what I mean? So then just add every single place that we work closing at the same time, And so I think what was good about lockdown is organizations like ours popped up. The National Independent Venue Association popped up, and they were really the brain trust and the force behind Save Our Stages. But all kinds of new advocacy organizations, the American Circus Alliance and the New Music Workers, like so many arts workers themselves stepped into advocacy to like ring the bell and let people know like what we do, where we are, and how it benefits dynamic local economies and, quality of life and mental health. It was arts and culture that kind of sustained us and got us through the pandemic. We were all like scrolling through, endless
100%.
Disney Plus and Netflix, and we were all beaming into like, virtual play readings and virtual symphonies and concerts and all that kind of stuff. So I think that actually, once the Biden administration came in, there had been a lot of sustained energy around communicating to the federal government just how important we are. And the response to that was, Biden's increase of funding. I think when he came into office, just the NEA, for example, I think that was like at around 200. So by the time he left, it was up to 207. Obviously, we would love that number to be in the billions, but as it pertains to U.S. politics and U.S. support, Biden's support was aggressive, and in a bipartisan way, it was supported. And he reinstituted the President's Committee on the Arts. And so he actually did bring in a mix of arts workers, union heads, celebrities, professionals who did from time to time convene and then report to the president about a few things. I think their notable contribution was this idea of working with the Surgeon General on the loneliness epidemic in America. And the Surgeon General collaborated with the President's Committee on the Arts to be like, this is part of the American solution to the American depression and loneliness epidemic is the arts. Obviously, it brings us out of our houses. It brings us into community and, all the mental benefits. And so I think that politicizing the arts and co-opting the arts and having almost kind of a schizophrenic approach to federal arts appropriations is new since January 20th. And there is something wild about the idea of wanting to zero out a $207 million endowment, but to put $250 million into renovating one building in Washington, D.C., because the same budget that zeroes out the NEA appropriates $250 million to renovate the Kennedy Center, which the president has appointed himself the artistic director of, essentially. So there is a little bit of artistic schizophrenia currently at the federal level. So while there's this appetite for destruction, there's also an appetite, I guess, for construction on the Kennedy Center.
Wow. That's, like you said, it's quite wild and schizophrenic at the moment. I want to ask on a personal front, because, you've been one of the people to take up the mantle of leadership on Be an Arts Hero and Arts Workers United. And that's obviously a lot of work to take up that leadership. What was your impetus? Obviously, you're passionate about the issue and very knowledgeable, but what motivated you to be at the forefront of this?
Well, I think, and this probably comes from my mom, who is a child advocate. My mom's a law professor, and probably one of her biggest claims to fame is she really has worked on the rights of a child. So she's really been at the forefront of, like, in custody hearings or complicated divorces, et cetera, is making sure that kids are heard and are part of the process, and that they have some agency in decisions being made about them. So I think there has been a role model for me in my life as somebody who stands up for people who have not traditionally been able to stand up for themselves. And over the course of my career, there have definitely been times where I, as an actor in a rehearsal space, have seen, I guess what I would call maybe a bully director kind of being insensitive or unnecessarily harsh. What's been ironic is, like, I can handle that, and I feel like I can handle myself. But, like, when I see that perpetrated against my fellow castmates enough, like, I start to develop a very specific kind of personality to deal with it. And so there have been a few times in my artistic life where I have basically stood up and said, like, hey, listen, we're all in here. We're all doing this. This is what we need to make this a good process. And then I kind of took that in 2016 into the Fair Wage on Stage movement, which was a bunch of New York-based actors had gotten together for, like, a series of conversations in salons about the state of being a professional stage actor in New York. The economics of it were becoming so unsustainable. The cost of living in New York was just skyrocketing, and real wages, despite union representation for actors, like, really had not risen since the 80s, not in any way that kept up with inflation. And so we found ourselves in this situation where oftentimes you would be better off on unemployment and not working than working at some of the most prestigious professional theaters in New York City. And that reality was unsustainable and untenable. And so these conversations that were all had by people that were working those contracts in New York all the time turned into conversations with our union, because the union caught word that we were having these conversations, and they were like, hey, will you come have those conversations in front of us? And we were like, yeah. And so when we did that, I was then invited to become part of the 2016 Off-Broadway negotiating committee. And we had a lot of conversations with our employers and with each other about having to, like, really make a big market correction to make life sustainable for professional actors in New York City. And so what ended up happening with that is we ended up getting up to 80% increases on some of those contracts in a single cycle, which were some of the largest single contract increases in American labor history. Wow. And we did it without going on strike, because we were able to, like, really communicate with our employers just how much we loved them and respected them and considered them to be our artistic brothers and sisters and our artistic homes, and just really saying, hey, listen, this has to change, or you're just not even going to have the workforce that you want. And so that kind of brought me into the union, and I was a counselor for several years. And then during lockdown, it was kind of those peripheral associations with politics that I had encountered through Actors Equity Association that led to kind of a big paying attention to during the pandemic of what was going to happen to us, because I was vividly conscious, because I, like millions of other arts workers, I lost 3 jobs in 24 hours on March 11th. I had 3 things set up and none of those 3 things ended up happening. And so my livelihood was gone, and I was reliant on that federal pandemic unemployment compensation. That extra $600 a week of unemployment insurance was what was keeping me in my apartment and what was keeping so many people with a roof over their head and food in their belly and with insurance during a deadly global pandemic. So as the CARES Act came out and really did not have what was needed to support, stabilize, and sustain the creative economy and arts workers, I started to really pay attention to what my local politicians were saying. And at some point, I think it was Chuck Schumer said something to somebody in the arts and culture sector that was like, hey, listen, it's an emergency. Everybody's in pain, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and you guys essentially aren't squeaking loud enough. And I took that, to be like that. There is something very, very ironic in that, because we are the sexiest and squeakiest of all the people. And so it doesn't make any sense that we are not squeaking loud enough. I mean, we are, there's some of us that have 120 million followers on Instagram. Our squeaks matter.
Yeah, 100%.
And so that kind of was the genesis of Be an Arts Hero. Was Congress was contemplating the HEROES Act at the time, right? And so the idea was we needed Congress to be an arts hero and to include earmarked funding for the creative economy and arts workers inside the HEROES Act to stabilize it. And so it started out with me and Brooke Ishibashi, who was a fellow counselor. And Be an Arts Hero basically started with the 2 of us kind of opening our Rolodexes. And the idea is that we were going to try to find the fanciest people that we knew to make noise, because we thought, if Lin-Manuel Miranda just does 2 or 3 tweets about this, the problem's solved. You know what I mean? It's like Congress will listen to Lin. You know what I mean? If Lin-Manuel Miranda tweets Congress Be an Arts Hero, Congress will give us, billions of dollars. So that was the kind of idea that animated the beginning of Be an Arts Hero. And so within a couple of days of us kind of opening our Rolodexes and starting to reach out to people, I brought in Jenny Grace McHolm, who was one of our other co-founders, who is a genius with graphic design and all things marketing and communications. And she started to we started these social media profiles, and we started to create state specific graphics for literally every single member of the Senate. And all the graphics talked about, this state, how many arts workers there were, how many billions of dollars it brought into the economy. And then we tagged those politicians, and that really took off like wildfire. And we just got followers and followers and followers. And I think because we were doing all this state specific stuff, people were able to grab that content, screenshot it, share it, spread it, tag it. And shortly thereafter, our 4th co-founder, Matthew Lee Earlbach, came in and started writing this glorious op-ed with us that ended up going into American Theater Magazine. And at that point, the 4 of us were this kind of nexus of activity and brain trust. And we were working, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week for basically the rest of lockdown. And
wow.
within a couple of weeks, we really had succeeded in making we started squeaking pretty dang loud. We got Billy Porter. Well, yeah. Well, we got Billy Porter on Seth Meyers, and we got B.D. Wong on Good Morning America. We got Jane Krakowski on Jenna and Hoda. I mean, and we successfully got all kinds of people to be tweeting and share. We got Cher was sharing our content, Bette Midler, Idina Menzel, Hillary Clinton jumped in at one point and was sharing Be an Arts Hero content. You know what I mean? It was taking off. And after, I would say about a month of like all this kind of activity from arts workers themselves, we didn't really see much movement from the feds as to like responding in any way. And so we're like, okay, well, maybe we need to like add direct advocacy to this equation. And so then, we kind of put out a call for volunteers, and over the course of a few weeks, like we went from having like 5 or 6 people to having like almost 60 people. And we're like, okay, what do we do with all these people? We are not arts administrators. We don't run arts organizations. We are arts workers ourselves. And so, we really found ourselves kind of like building a plane in the air. And we started doing all of these initiatives, these incredibly passionate, hardworking, brilliant, talented volunteers. And so we started reaching out to congressional offices, and our volunteers would like come up with these customized briefs for these meetings. And so we would have a meeting with Senator Tom Tillis, and we literally had a research team that had like created a brief for us that was like all about South Carolina, or is it North Carolina? Okay. Anyway, but would have all this like state specific stuff, and it would talk about the senator and their relationship to the creative economy and arts. And I mean, these were just brilliant documents that we would look at for, half an hour before we'd go into these meetings. And then we would go into these meetings and we would have these robust conversations. And what was really wild about it is typically a congressional office slots about a half an hour for these meetings. And especially during the pandemic, everybody in America was in crisis. And so, I mean, I can only imagine what that was like, because now that I know a little bit more about DC and how DC functions and how crucial staffers are to running the US government, and just knowing that they were literally just going from meeting to meeting to meeting from like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And I'm sure they were going and, drinking half a pint of bourbon and passing out to do it all over again the next day. But what was amazing is we would find ourselves in some of these meetings, and we'd hit the half hour mark, and we'd be like, thank you so much for your time. And they'd be like, wait, what about this? What about that? And so we found ourselves in this interesting situation where not only were we doing this lobbying and advocacy work that none of us had ever really done before, but we were effective. And, we were told in no uncertain terms by several Senate offices, whoever you are, keep doing this because you are doing this well. And we were like, thanks. I mean, I'm sure it had to do with like, the 4 of us are actors.
You're performers, right? So you prepare, you got,
exactly.
You know how to present yourself. So
yeah. And so, I mean, we would just come into these offices and like, just give a very, one of the things that I talked about, we'll get to this later, I'm sure, but after the House hearing that happened, I did go to DC. And I ended up visiting a couple of the offices I collaborated with leading up to that hearing. And they were like, well, it was so much of your advocacy that made this happen. And thank you so much for your testimony and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, I'm not coming in here trying to like pretend that fossil fuels are good for the environment. You know what I mean? Like I 1000% believe in what I'm saying, and the numbers are on my side. You know what I mean? Like arts advocacy is easy. I mean,
it's an easy argument.
Yeah, I'm like, that's what I mean. It's not necessarily easy to leverage the argument into money, but the argument is easy because all the statistics are on our side. And so we did not have a problem, the 4 of us, passionately presenting these things to Congress. And so that turned into like I said, an all day, everyday thing. There was a time when we were taking 5 meetings a day with the Hill. And then that translated finally into, in December of 2020, passage of extended unemployment insurance, COBRA subsidies, so people can keep their insurance during a deadly pandemic, and the passage of Save Our Stages, which was first introduced as a $10 billion intervention that kind of really was specifically for like rock clubs, comedy clubs, etc. And then thanks to our help and the union's help. And it's very important, I think, to acknowledge all of the people that were involved in the advocacy. I think something that can happen in advocacy is this group or that group will appear to be taking credit for some huge thing that it actually took a ton of people to do. So I just want to be very intentional whenever I speak about these things to acknowledge that there were a lot of entities, a lot of organizations, and a lot of people pushing for these things. But we were definitely a huge part of the push that brought people like, Chuck Schumer into the conversation to turn Save Our Stages into an intervention that also included Broadway and also included museums. You know what I mean? And so what ended up happening is that Save Our Stages intervention went from a $10 billion intervention to a $16 billion intervention. And so then that led into 2021, where our efforts kind of pivoted. But I think that long tirade probably answered your question of like how we kind of stepped into advocacy leadership during the pandemic. It's like there are definitely times where I'm like, I should have just, learned to make Dutch oven sourdough bread like everybody else. I'd probably be a lot more sane right now if I would have just like done a lot more YouTube cooking videos and kind of stuff. But for us, this wasn't, this was definitely about self-preservation. And as I said, I think I've always gravitated towards trying to step in on behalf of people who need help and aren't being given the respect and help that they need. But also the 4 of us acknowledge that this advocacy was also part of our coping mechanism of being in lockdown.
That's it. And obviously working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week in pandemic is probably something the antithesis of what most people were doing. But
we were never just sitting staring out the window going, when will this end? When will this end? What am I going to do with the hours in the day? Like if anything, it was like, oh my God, how is it 3 a.m. again?
Yeah. Does it feel now? I mean, obviously now you've entered a new phase with the current administration and you're still here as an advocate. It must feel like a large mountain to climb to keep advocating for this. And what are some of the 2 questions? Like, what's the focus now and what do you think that you can do now? And then the second question would be, for people who are our audience and in America, what can they do to support and participate in this movement?
All right. There's a lot of really good questions there. And I want to temper this answer in a way that's not too horrifying and depressing. So maybe first and foremost, I can talk to your audience and say, in this moment, arts workers need your vocal advocacy and support. But, so do park rangers. So does the librarian at the Library of Congress. So does the Social Security Administration and the like I said, there's a real appetite for destruction at the federal level right now. And there's a lot of people and a lot of entities in free fall and in crisis. And so I definitely would encourage anybody who feels the value of arts and culture in their lives to write a letter, make a phone call. These things actually do matter. And even if it's like a little petition, the petition goes in and the staffers go, okay, well, like 50,000 people sign this petition. That means something. They actually do the math in the offices. They have all kinds of, data analytics and this many phone calls means one thing. This many handwritten letters means another thing. And they're weighted differently because some take different levels of effort to do. So they've kind of got it into a science. So anybody and everybody who cares at all should be talking to their policymakers, their representatives and senators saying like, hey, do not zero out the NEA, the NEH, and the IMLS. Do not zero them out. Keep them in the budget. And not only that, there needs to be some sort of demand for the people that have been terminated at these agencies to return to work, right? So that the NEH can like basically open back up. There was just an announcement, I think like last week, where one of the big foundations is stepping in with like an emergency multi-billion dollar, not billion, but like $100 million response to try to shore up the state's agencies for humanities, because the National Endowment for Humanities is essentially dead and the grants are shut down. So one of these big foundations is trying to step into the void, but that agency at the federal level needs to be back opened, and the IMLS as well. So there's like a lot of legal proceedings right now going on and lawsuits that hopefully will compel some of these things to happen. But Congress needs to be a huge part of this and to, put stopgaps and measures in place so these places can't just be summarily, shut down in the way that they are. Also, it's hard because, as I said, thousands of organizations are getting these termination grants from the NEA. And last week, 10 directors inside the NEA walked off the job because of these termination letters, essentially leading there being like a real void of leadership within the endowment right now. So all of these kind of federal entities are in crisis. So any kind of conversation that you can have with your policymaker to be like, okay, federal support for arts and culture and arts workers seems to be in crisis. What are you going to do about it? Right? So that's one thing that your audience can do. But now maybe I'll contemplate something that's a little darker, which is that, it's very possible that with a lot of these entities and agencies, it's over as we know it. Like their existence and how they function, there may be damage being done that is so seismic that these entities are not necessarily able to recover, or at least not operate the way they did before. So there needs to be a lot of things that can happen. So one, I have all the hope in the world that these entities survive. But these are my thoughts. If the situation that we are in is one in which these entities essentially stop functioning or disappear, then when we get to the other side of this cataclysmic historical moment, and that's not if, that's when we are going to get to the other side of this. And when we get to the other side of this, we are going to have to visit this now empty field. And in this empty field, we have an opportunity to build something new. So this might be an opportunity in a couple of years from now to bring the people back and to bring the functioning of these entities back, not as separate individual agencies, but as a Department of Arts and Culture led by a Secretary of Arts and Culture, somebody who would sit on the Domestic Policy Council at the executive level. And if we did have a Secretary of Arts and Culture sitting on the cabinet, on the Domestic Policy Council, then you would have somebody literally at the table with the president telling them how valuable the arts and culture sector is and the arts workers and the creative economy is. And so we don't find ourselves in this situation where arts and culture becomes a political football where we talk about zeroing out these agencies, because there's somebody there at the table with the president being like, sir or ma'am, or
whatever
person president, exactly. So like I'm trying to put the optimistic spin on this, which is like, maybe there's actually a way to build back better on the other side of this, to have something to have even more federal support. Maybe the destruction of federal support now means that there can actually be more federal support later. And also, this idea of what you were talking about how did lockdown impact federal contemplation of the creative economy? There is more creative economy and arts related legislation in Congress right now than in the history of this country. There is, and you can find a lot of that legislation on our website, artsworkersunited.com. Go check it out. And it's really exciting because you can go through our website and kind of click on each piece of legislation, and it shows you who introduced it and what it does and how to support it. But my fantasy is, on the other side of this, a real unified, concerted effort by people in advocacy, the unions, the state's arts advocates, the national advocacy organizations, to get like some sort of an arts new deal, right? To get all of these pieces of legislation kind of rolled into like an incredible omnibus creative economy, arts and culture spending bill that could radically transform the country and how it operates and how it sees arts workers and the creative economy. You've got, Brian Schatz, who, reliably introduces some amazing arts and culture legislation like every term. And you do have people like John Cornyn and A.B. Klobuchar. And I wish I could just right off the top of my head list every single person in Congress who supports the creative economy. I can't right off the top of my head. But the important thing is there are, Susan Bonamici in Oregon and Representative Teresa Letra Fernandez in New Mexico. That, like, there are so many people in Congress that I do feel get it and are getting it even more as time goes on. And I think especially during the pandemic, a lot of people started to really get it. And if we got enough of Congress to get it on the other side of this moment, we could really do something in this country. We could really turn a corner and build a future that really is characterized by community cohesion and opportunities all over the place for people to step out of their houses and be in the world with each other, to step away from their screens and come into community with each other. And I think that's something that we really need in this country right now, is the kind of compassion, affection, and respect that the arts seem to promote and engender. And like I said, anywhere the arts or arts workers are, you have all these socioeconomic benefits. You know what I mean? Like crime goes down and test scores go up. And, like I said, it's just sunshine, happiness, and money everywhere that we go. So I can imagine an America that's just a lot more happy, prosperous, and peaceful if we had, more federal support for arts and culture.
Yeah. Well, look, if we've got more people like you on the ground, Carson, for sure that's going to happen. I have much admiration for the work that you're doing. And, for somebody who has spent their entire career also in the arts and is so passionate about the industry as well, it's just really joyful, honestly, to hear somebody fight so fiercely for the advocacy of our industry. And thank you so much for spending time with us on the StageLync podcast. It's just truly a pleasure to know you and hear about your work.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's been great to talk with you about it.
Thank you for listening to the StageLync podcast. StageLync is an online platform that gives you access and connection to the live performing arts. As a guest, you can read about live performing arts from across the globe and gain insights from performers and artists on stage and all the amazing people who work behind the curtain. If you are an industry professional, StageLync Pro offers jobs, networks, and career support tools, and you can build your own professional profile on the site. As a StageLync podcast listener, you are eligible for 20% off your StageLync Pro membership. Visit us at stagelync.com and when joining, use the code SLPodcast. StageLync. That's StagelYNC.com.